Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tina Coburn. I'm an academic here in the law school at QUT in the Australian Centre for Health Law Research, and I'm very happy to be here this afternoon to chair this final session, which is about health care. So we've got three speakers again in this session, and the first speaker is Dr. Bruce Baer Arnold from the University of Canberra. And Dr. Arnold teaches contract, IP and innovation law at the University of Canberra. His research centres on the law regarding access to information, particularly privacy, trade secrets and patents, and also the regulatory failure in the healthcare sector, which I'm also interested in. He's currently writing about genomic privacy principles and practice, and on the editorial panel board of the Privacy Law Bulletin and an OECD Health Information Infrastructure panellist. His work has appeared in really good journals, quality journals, the Melbourne University Law Review, the Journal of Medical Ethics, the International Journal of Communication Law and Policy, Local Government Law Journal, the Alternative Law Journal, and of course other publications. So we welcome him here today. His topic is Open to Whom? Questions about innovation and access in the health sector. So please make him welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so I thought, given that my presentation is going to be, Matthew won't be surprised, my presentation is going to be a bit gloomy, or possibly just a bit disruptive. I'd start off by giving you some good news. So we've heard today a number of times about facial recognition, more broadly about biometrics, certainly about information sharing within government. The good news today is that one of the parliamentary committees in the national parliament has fairly soundly rejected the latest Home Affairs national identity matching, national identity sharing bill. It's been sent back, and the rationale appears to be, because I haven't seen the full report yet, rationale seems to be that the overall bill was defective and certainly provided insufficient protection for law-abiding citizens and otherwise. So we can think of this as possibly as an epochal moment, overall good news for civil liberties, and an interesting example of if you like, of government policy or potential government policy that will controvert what I'm about to say. So bear in mind I'm giving you something that may be a bit polemical rather than sort of a detailed factual analysis. This is certainly not an extract from my PhD, and I apologise for that. So, we're talking about openness. Openness, I would argue, it's now a very loaded buzzword. It's productive, it seems, of everything that's good or otherwise desirable. So, we have open government, which in practice often translates as FOI officers feeling quite open to say no to public accountability. We have open banking, which means that the financial oligopolies that were rather unavailingly smacked in the Hayne Royal Commission will in practice feel quite free to continue to openly exploit consumers. And we have open science, where universities simultaneously bewail the LexisNexis or CCH walled garden, but obey an institutional imperative to prioritise the commercialisation of health research. An open science where citizen scientists have a role to play, but from a public health perspective, need to be a bit wary about misusing a biological toy box while engaging in biohacking. Now, in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to talk somewhat irreverently, did give you a trigger warning, somewhat irreverently about innovation and access in the health sector. And I'm going to be trying to offer a somewhat holistic view, rather than a critique of Doha or initiatives such as Patents for Humanity, critiques that have been more persuasively provided by peers such as Professor Rimmer. And in essence, I'm going to suggest that a question underlying open is open to whom and responsive to whom. It's not the only question, but it's one worth considering, not least because it may provoke thought about the scope for change and about agency. Now, in the promo for this presentation, I claim that it's axiomatic that best practice in the development and delivery of health services involves openness. That involves scrutiny by clinicians, researchers, policymakers and consumers, rather than simply questions about reshaping patent law or providing public and private subsidies to consumers of medical devices and pharmaceuticals. And subsidies are fundamentally important. I'm thus concerned with openness as access to information across health systems, including reporting about products and reporting about practices that might well be novel, but are harmful when implemented. Openness as a matter of principle and practice may conflict with regulatory capture and with regulatory incapacity, in particular bureaucratic perceptions that access to information involves inordinate administrative costs or inhibits the proper functioning of government or simply deters innovation. So I'll start by contextualising that rather brusque statement with a reminder of the Prime Minister's recent warning to officials that they exist to implement policy, not to develop policy, and certainly not to critique policy, whether publicly or indeed privately. The former Public Service Commissioner, senior figure, somewhat stringently described the freedom of information regime in Australia as pernicious, apparently not having read the object provisions in the actual FOI Act. And if we look at the responses by Commonwealth agencies to FOI requests regarding health and other matters, we can see that officials have indeed heeded John Lloyd and not embraced an act that is ultimately meant to foster public goods beyond formal administrative accountability. That resistance to openness is a characteristic of both the Australian Health Practitioner Regulation Agency and our National Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices Gatekeeper, the TGA. From the perspective of openness in the health sector, the TGA makes heroic efforts to obfuscate inaction regarding health products or what consumers might reasonably regard as health products. And notably, it has a statutory immunity so that it is not open to litigation over its regulatory failures. This is possibly something that we need to remove. Resistance is also a characteristic of the Australian Medical Association, which, in an exemplary display of paternalism by male gods in white coats, kindly saved female consumers from worry by not disclosing a commercial interest in the innovative device at the centre of the recent pelvic mesh disaster. If you're interested in an astute analysis of that disaster, I can point you to my former colleague, Dr. Benithan, and in particular her submission to the parliamentary inquiry last year. We still don't have mandatory, readily accessible disclosure of interests in the delivery of health services. We still don't have real disclosure of what I wickedly characterised a couple of years ago as pharma payola, the inducements to prescribing that are provided by drug and medical device companies. Pressure for openness there has come from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, not from the Australian Medical Association and other professional bodies. So much for sunlight as the disinfectant in a world where fake news, we heard about fake news a moment ago, where fake news fosters distrust of fact-based medicine and encourages folk-based harms such as the anti-vaccination movement. We've heard about trust, we've heard about legitimacy. Somewhat closer to home, resistance is apparent within universities, institutions that should look beyond the profit imperative and on occasion actually speak truth to power. It's evident out west, where Murdoch University, for example, appears to be busy suing a whistleblower into bankruptcy after he disclosed alleged wrongdoing. In the health sector, it's evident in criticism of UNSW, where we see claims, and exceptionally, I'm going to quote Dyson Heydon, we see claims, in Dyson Heydon's words, about one hand languidly washing the other in investigating alleged, I emphasize alleged, investigating alleged misconduct by a leading researcher over several years. Openness is at odds with publishing practice that sees health, law and other researchers in the North and South alike priced out of access to journals and databases. That's reflective of a fundamental tension in openness at universities. Institutions want low-cost access but push their academics to publish in premium-priced journals. Those journals are open, they're open to quality submissions, but they're often not open as in free. Information, it's often been said, wants to be free. Information famously wants to be free. But in practice, vice-chancellors want something else. They want to be free of government. They want to be free of budget constraints. So if we're looking at institutional cultures in the health space, that means there's an emphasis on sometimes exclusive deals with entities such as Swiss and Merck, rather than just the controversial Ramsay Centre. The Vice-Chancellor's door is, I think, always open. It's open if you bring enough cash. And we also see patent production as a dominant metric, an artefact of bureaucratic rationality in institutional cultures that emphasise commercialisation rather than open science, and therefore open, genuine health. And if we're thinking holistically, and I'm suggesting if we think in terms of much of what we hear today, we need to think holistically in terms of, if you like, an information ecosystem. If we're thinking holistically about health open, open more directly conflicts with traditional incentives for innovation through patent and other law, providing investors with scope for egregious rent seeking. Now, in a previous QUT seminar, generously organised by Matthew, I described Pharma Bro Martin Shkreli as symptomatic of restrictions on access to essential medicines in the North and the South alike. There are real restrictions through pricing in the North, rather than just in the South. And I suggest that the traditional North-South differentiation is a bit simplistic. We need to be conscious that mechanisms such as pharmaceutical benefit scheme, a foundation of what was originally called the Australian settlement, are fundamental in ensuring access by ordinary Australians to medical goods. And ordinary Australians include people like you and I, people with a middle level income, rather than, say, people who are on welfare or on the dole, or however we want to characterise it, often rather pejorative terms. Now, in retaining and expanding that social equity mechanism, we need to publicly crunch numbers about prescribing patterns, being alert, for example, to potential conflicts of interest. We also need to deepen our research base by publicly looking at outcomes rather than assuming that novel, inventive, innovative equals effective. My research focus for the next coming 2 years centres, as we heard, on genomic privacy and data protection, something that's, I'm afraid, is a bit at odds with many of the claims about precision medicine, something that's been promoted as a life and indeed a budget-saving revolution in healthcare. And you may have encountered some of those claims, often couched in the same fervour but with the very same incomprehension that people exhibit when they refer to blockchain. Precision medicine, truly individualised, diagnostic and therapeutics, promises to address intractable conditions that range from baldness to Alzheimer's and ADHD. And if it arrives, it's a bit like AI. We've heard that AI may well arrive, but possibly a couple of years down the track. If it arrives, we will apparently not have to worry about the TGA's indifference over the past 3 years to concerns, and these are legitimate concerns, to concerns about breast implants. We won't have to worry because a cure will always be at hand. I suggest that reality, just like the blockchain silver bullet, is just a little bit more complicated. The arrival of precision medicine seems predicated on mining of population-scale health records. The bigger the better. Poll the data higher. Analyse it with sort of the best available algorithms. Now, that health big data will be available to the likes of Pfizer and Merck, but not to you and I. It may not be available to many research institutions associated with universities. It may be harvested by governments on a mandatory basis, and there's a question there about legitimacy, and as an extension of the the current open data initiatives that we've heard about today, it may well be sold to the highest or best connected bidder. And the model there is the failed UK care data program, where bulk health data was considered to be one of the remaining bits of the family silver post Margaret Thatcher, and there were active plans to sell whole of population data to, in essence, entities that had the right cash book, the right checkbook, or the right legitimacy in terms of possibly being associated with Oxford and Cambridge. It's a matter of big data to the rescue with disregard of Kant's categorical imperative through a value system in which the promised ends justify obfuscation of consent, potential misrepresentation about accuracy, and, importantly, commercial restrictions on data use through patents and trade secrets and contract, as we heard earlier today. Now, one base for my comment about misrepresentation is that many of the ills that might be addressed through precision medicine are in fact quite complicated. They're as much a matter of lifestyle as they are of defective code in the genomic book of life. Gene therapy, or an individualised med, are thus unlikely to be wholly effective. Within the current international innovation framework, centred on TRIPS, they certainly won't be cheap. And in that framework, we might construe health research, delivery and policy as open, but open to abuse and ongoing exploitation. I'd like to suggest, however, that those areas are open. They are open to intervention and open to education as a foundation for truly open health, something that's centred on global flourishing, the sort of thing that's been espoused by people like Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, rather than simply the exchange for secrets reward ideology that underpins the Patents Act of 1990 in Australia. Now, Trotsky, not a person of whom I'm a particular fan, Trotsky apocryphally said that Nicholas II wasn't an especially bad man, just a man sadly devoid of imagination. And we know that that one ended in tears. At an international level, my suggestion is that what we need is imagination, unlike poor Nicholas. And I'm not talking about Donald Trump's weird type of imagination. Instead, I'm talking about the practical imagination and what Martha Minow and Spellman characterise as an openness to experience, the sort of openness to experience, the willingness to make mistakes, the willingness to experiment, that resulted in, for example, the US New Deal and indeed the UDHR. Dr. Roosevelt famously experimented until he got it right. He made mistakes, but in the end, there was flourishing. And my suggestion is we can too. And if we are seeking to flourish, seeking to foster that flourishing, the flourishing that is ultimately the rationale for precision medicine, it's not just about making money, we might bravely shape health environments through meaningful sugar taxes and indeed through fat labelling. The High Court's response to trademark litigation by cigarette companies, sort of thing that Matthew has written very eloquently and incisively about, indicates that such behavioural nudges are not comprehensively precluded by the Australian Constitution or indeed by TRIPS. And we might deepen consumer agency, respectfully, through changes to the education system and through some creativity on the part of regulators. The ACCC Digital Platforms Inquiry, the one that sort of the government is hopefully looking at the moment, indicates that gatekeepers do not need to be as passive as the TGA, and they do not need to confuse their mission, fostering public health, with industry support. Now, this is particularly the case when most of the industry is located offshore, often located in tax terms in tax minimisation locales such as the Caymans. By all means, gain an incentive for innovation, but respect your social licence by actually paying what your society, ultimately your consumers, would consider to be a fair share of tax. If we had more tax, if we had more imagination, we might well build capacity within the TGA, something that is as much a matter of culture as it is of bodies at the workstations. Ongoing incapacitation of the TGA and the FDA is far more pernicious than the FOI Act and is easier to solve than climate change, a change that ultimately has profound health impacts. And if we are committed to a exchange for secrets rationale for mechanism for innovation, we might require innovators to unlock test data, potentially using the emerging open data framework, and, more importantly, to require comprehensive, timely reporting to a publicly accessible health incident reporting portal, something that we can all see, something that, say, health researchers, such as Professor Coburn here, can crunch numbers. Doesn't have to be left to gnomes in the health department. And that portal something that's readily interrogable by independent analysts rather than just medical insurers, would provide an openness that's epidemiologically invaluable and that addresses the regulatory capture that's the salient attribute of the TGA. At an international level, we might engage in a rigorous and persuasive critique about a meaningful right to health, something that's ultimately more than just a bit of puff. That critique would involve a convention that addresses the challenges of an existential climate crisis and requires nations such as Australia and Canada to actually step up in favour of greater information sharing about pharma pricing and pharma data, the sort of thing that's been advocated by Jamie Love and indeed by Dr. Rimmer. That sharing is good for the taxpayer rather than just for consumers in countries that are looking at TRIPS flexibilities and countries like Australia. And in conclusion, because I promised not to go over time today, in conclusion, we might encourage self-reflection on the part of gatekeepers such as the AMAA and AHPRA, alongside the establishment of a dignitarian privacy regime in which big data about health or otherwise embodies values of respect, including proportionality. And I would hope that the Parliamentary Committee today has taken on board concerns about proportionality. So embodies values of respect, including proportionality, rather than just a commercialisation imperative.